In September of 1894, a Hopi elder pointed toward the Painted Desert and told a government surveyor something he had never heard before. Not that something had lived beneath the desert. That part was already accepted. The Hopi emergence traditions had spoken about the world below for generations. What stopped the surveyor from writing for several minutes was the next sentence. The elder told him the ones below had never left. Over the next 6 weeks, the surveyor carried the same question to 4 different villages. 7 elders answered it. The descriptions changed very little. Large, covered in reddish hair, living in chambers beneath the stone country north of the mesas. One elder described seeing tracks, another described the hands, a third refused to identify the location on a map, and one of them ended the conversation with a warning the surveyor copied into his journal, word for word. Some entrances are remembered so they can be avoided. The journal survived, the names survived, and according to the people who shared the story in 1894, so did the occupants. The first mention came during a conversation that had nothing to do with hidden chambers or things beneath the desert. The surveyor had been asking about old trails, water sources, trading routes between villages, the kinds of questions government men always asked when they arrived in Hopi country during the late 19th century. Then an elder interrupted him, not to answer the question, to correct it. According to the elder, people spent too much time asking who built the abandoned places scattered across the mesas, and not enough time asking why some places had never been abandoned at all. The surveyor wrote the sentence down immediately, because the old man wasn't speaking about ruins, he was speaking in the present tense. The conversation changed direction after that. The elder pointed north toward the broken country of the Painted Desert, and explained that there were places where people once travelled carefully, places where fires were never lit after dark, places where children were told not to shout, not because the land was sacred, because sound carried. The surveyor thought he had misunderstood the translation, so he asked the interpreter to repeat it. The interpreter did. The elder nodded. Then came the sentence that would follow the surveyor through the rest of his journey. Some places below are still being used. Over the following weeks he carried the same question to other villages. He expected different answers, different stories. Instead he encountered something far stranger. The locations changed, the elders changed, the wording changed, but the warning remained almost identical every time. There were places beneath the desert where people were once known to live. And according to the elder speaking in 1894, some of those places had never been found empty. By the end of the month, the surveyor had stopped asking whether the villages agreed with each other. He wanted to know how they all knew the same thing, because by then he had spoken to 7 elders, and none of them had laughed when the subject came up. None of them treated it as folklore, and none of them were willing to point to the locations on a map. By itself, that meant very little. Together. It was enough to make him keep writing, because the stories were only beginning, and the descriptions were about to become very specific. The oldest account did not come from the surveyor. It came from an elder named Talisquapa. According to the journal, the conversation turned when the surveyor asked whether anyone living had ever seen the beings the stories described. The answer surprised him. Yes, not recently, but within living memory of the village. Talisquapa said his grandfather's father had encountered one near a place the interpreter translated as the Red Chamber. The location was described as part of a cave system north of the mesas, hidden among the broken rock country beyond the settlements. The encounter happened before sunrise. The man had been travelling alone. He reached the entrance expecting to collect water stored in shaded rock pools inside the formation. Instead, he saw movement deeper inside the passage. At first, he believed it was a bear, then it stood up. According to the account, the figure was taller than any man in the village. Its shoulders were wider, its body was covered in reddish hair, and before the witness could move closer, it stepped backward into the darkness and disappeared, deeper into the chamber system. The story would be easy to dismiss if it appeared only once. The problem is that the location kept returning. Different elders referred to the same place, the same chamber, the same northern country, the same instruction: leave it alone. One elder refused to continue the conversation after the location was mentioned. Another agreed to describe the place, but refused to allow it to be marked on a map. A third reportedly laughed when the surveyor asked whether anyone had tried to enter. His answer was simple: people who know where a place is do not always want visitors to find it. That attitude survived long after 1894. Even in modern times, Hopi representatives have occasionally spoken about locations within the canyon and desert that are considered inappropriate for excavation or public access. Whatever the elders believed was beneath the painted desert, their concern was never proving it existed. Their concern was making sure people stayed away from it. By the third week of interviews, Alexander Maloud had stopped trying to determine whether the elders believed what they were telling him. That question had become irrelevant. What interested him now was something much stranger. The descriptions refused to drift. Oral traditions change over time. Historians know this. Names disappear, distances grow, generations compress themselves into a single remembered ancestor, and separate events slowly become one story. That is the normal behavior of memory carried through centuries without writing. This story behaved differently. The details remained stubbornly fixed. The height remained, the hair remained, the underground chambers remained, and most strangely of all, the hands remained. According to the notes preserved from September 1894, the first elder described hands that did not match those of ordinary people. Maloud initially assumed the interpreter had misunderstood the meaning. Extra fingers appear in stories all over the world as symbols of status, divinity, or ceremonial importance. But that interpretation collapsed when the same detail appeared again in another village, then again in another conversation days later, each time without prompting, and each time described not as symbolism but as anatomy. What makes that detail interesting is not whether it is true, it is how specific it is. Stories become larger with time. They rarely become more precise. Nobody preserves the memory of an exact physical characteristic for generations unless somebody somewhere believed that characteristic mattered enough to remember correctly. The same thing happened with the hair. Not black, not grey, not the colour associated with the people telling the story. Reddish brown. Repeated often enough that Maloud eventually stopped recording it as a separate observation and simply treated it as part of the established description. By this point, he had already spoken to elders separated by geography, clan affiliation, and ceremonial responsibilities. Yet the core image remained remarkably stable. Great height, full body hair, unusual hands, underground chambers, and a preference for avoiding the surface during daylight hours. Then the conversations moved somewhere even stranger. The surveyor asked the question any outsider would eventually ask. If these beings existed in the distant past, what happened to them? The answer surprised him because it assumed the question itself was mistaken. Nothing happened to them. That was the answer. The Hopi emergence traditions describe ancestors coming upward into the present world through the Sipapu and establishing communities on the mesas of northern Arizona. But according to several of the elders speaking to Maloud, not everything that belonged to the earlier world made the journey to the surface. Some remained where they had always been, below. This distinction appears repeatedly in the surviving material, and it may be the single most important detail in the entire account. The elders were not describing ruins beneath the desert. They were not describing abandoned tunnels or forgotten chambers left empty by time. They were describing occupancy, present tense, places still used, routes still travelled, entrances still avoided. That changes the character of the story completely. An abandoned city belongs to archaeology, an occupied one belongs to something else entirely. And according to one elder, that difference explained why certain places north of the mesas were never pointed out to outsiders, never marked on maps, and never discussed once the fires burned low and children were close enough to listen. Because curiosity and permission are not the same thing, and in Hopi country, some places were understood to require the second long before anyone considered the first. By October of 1894, Alexander M'Leod had developed a habit that appears repeatedly throughout his field journal. Whenever an elder mentioned a location, he reached for his maps. That was his profession. Everything became a location eventually. A spring became coordinates, a trail became a line, a canyon became a measurement. The West was being transformed into paper one survey at a time, and M'Leod had spent 20 years participating in that process. Then he reached the Hopi mesas. For the first time in his career, he encountered places that people knew existed but refused to place on maps. Not because they had forgotten where they were, because they remembered exactly where they were. That distinction mattered. The first refusal came after an elder mentioned a chamber system somewhere north of the villages beyond the broken country, where the rock shelves begin to fall away toward the painted desert. M'Leod unfolded his survey sheets. The old man shook his head. The location would not be marked. The conversation moved on. Several days later, the same thing happened again in another village, another reference to caves, another reference to openings in the stone country, another refusal. By the fourth occurrence, M'Leod stopped assuming coincidence. The refusal itself had become part of the tradition. The places existed. The locations were known. The locations simply did not belong on paper. One evening, the surveyor asked the obvious question. Why? The answer he recorded is one of the shortest responses in the entire journal. Because people go where maps tell them to go. The sentence stayed with him. Because by 1894 the American West was changing rapidly. Railroads moved first. Surveyors followed. Miners followed the surveyors. Then came roads, towns, fences, and extraction companies. A place that entered a map rarely remained unchanged for very long. The elders understood this perfectly. Their concern was never whether outsiders believed the stories. Their concern was what outsiders would do if they did. One elder explained that there were places where children were still instructed not to wander alone. Not everywhere. Specific places, specific canyons, specific openings in the rock. The warning had existed for so long that nobody in the village could identify when it had begun. The rule simply existed. You stayed away. No explanation required. M'Leod pressed further. Had anyone ignored the warning? Apparently, yes. The journal references several incidents without giving names or dates. A shepherd who failed to return when expected. Hunters who abandoned equipment and returned home by another route. Travellers who reached a location they had intended to visit and then chose not to continue. The frustrating thing for modern readers is that the details stop there. No dramatic endings, no monsters, no stories designed to frighten children. Just people changing their minds and leaving. Again and again. That pattern appears throughout the notes. Leave, turn around, choose another route, do not continue. The language remains practical rather than mythical, almost administrative, as though the subject being discussed was dangerous weather or unstable cliffs rather than stories about underground occupants. That tone may be the strangest part of the entire document. Fear sounds one way, familiarity sounds another. The elders sounded familiar. One conversation from late September seems to have disturbed M'Leod more than the others. An elder was asked directly whether the beings beneath the desert still existed. The answer recorded in the journal was immediate. Existence is not the question. The interpreter apparently struggled with the translation and asked for clarification. The old man tried again. The question is whether they wish to be found. M'Leod copied the sentence exactly as it was spoken. Several pages later, another entry appears. Short, almost an afterthought. The surveyor asked why the locations remained protected if the beings had retreated so far from human settlements. The elder looked toward the north before answering. Because some doors are closed from both sides. There are very few moments in the journal where M'Leod inserts his own opinion into the record. This was one of them. He wrote that the sentence produced visible discomfort among several men sitting nearby and that nobody attempted to continue the discussion afterward. The fire burned lower. The conversation moved elsewhere. The subject was finished for the evening. The following morning, the surveyor resumed ordinary work: water sources, agriculture, population records, livestock numbers. But the notes surrounding the underground places continued growing. By the end of the expedition, he had pages of descriptions but almost no locations, warnings but no coordinates, directions but no destinations, enough information to know that the places existed in memory, not enough information to find them. That may have been intentional, because the elders never behaved like men protecting a secret. They behaved like men protecting a boundary. There is a difference between those two things. Secrets exist to be hidden. Boundaries exist to be respected. More than a century later, that distinction still survives. Even today, Hopi representatives occasionally speak about locations connected to ceremonial knowledge and sacred geography that are not considered appropriate for excavation, tourism, or public investigation. The existence of the restriction is acknowledged openly. The location is not. Perhaps that is why the final sentence Malaud recorded on the subject feels so different from everything that came before. It was not a warning. It was not a threat. It was simply an observation. The old people do not fear what is below. They fear what happens when people above become curious. Alexander Malaud left the Hopi mesas in October of 1894 and returned to the work he had been sent to do: land surveys, boundary lines, water reports, the ordinary paperwork that filled government archives across the American West. From the outside, nothing about his career changed. He worked for another decade, filed his reports, completed his assignments, and yet when historians eventually opened his field journal decades later, one thing became obvious. The 6 weeks he spent among the Hopi never left him, because the final pages of the journal read differently from the first ones. The early entries sound like a surveyor: measurements, distances, agricultural notes, livestock numbers. The later entries sound like a man trying to decide what exactly he had been told, not whether the elders believed it. That question had already been answered. The question troubling him now was much simpler. Why had 7 different elders from 4 different villages described the same thing with such confidence? The names varied, the routes varied, the locations remained deliberately vague, but the foundation of the story never moved. Something lived below before the villages existed. Something remained after the villages were built. And according to the elders speaking in 1894, something still occupied parts of that underground world. The most important detail in the entire account may be the one most people ignore. The elders never attempted to convince him. There were no demonstrations, no attempts to lead him to an entrance, no effort to prove anything. The conversations carried the feeling of people discussing weather patterns or distant mountains, normal things, known things, things that required no defense because they were not considered controversial. To the surveyor, this was strange. To the elders, it was stranger that he found it strange. One passage near the end of the journal captures that difference perfectly. Malaud asked why the locations remained hidden if outsiders already doubted the stories. The elder listening to the question reportedly smiled before answering. A place does not become empty because visitors stop believing in it. That sentence stayed with Malaud. It may be the reason he copied it separately into the back pages of the notebook rather than leaving it among the ordinary field notes. Years later, long after he had left Arizona behind, he returned to the subject one final time. The sentence survives in his own handwriting. I do not know what lies beneath this country, but I no longer believe the people who live here are guessing. More than a century has passed since those conversations took place beside fires on the edge of the painted desert. The mesas remain, the cave systems remain, the stories remain, and perhaps most interesting of all, the boundaries remain. Some places are still not discussed publicly. Some locations are still protected. Some entrances, according to the people who know the country best, are still left alone. Whether those warnings protect archaeology, sacred history, or something else entirely is a question each person answers for themselves. But the Hopi position has remained remarkably consistent for a very long time. There are places beneath the desert that do not belong to us, and not every forgotten place is forgotten because people lost it. Sometimes a place survives because generation after generation made the same decision, to remember where it was, and then leave it alone. Thank you for watching. And before you go, consider the question Alexander Malaud carried with him when he left Arizona in the autumn of 1894. If 7 elders across 4 villages all preserved the same memory, what exactly were they remembering?